dispatches from the Glacier Front to fit in with the theme of with the series of talks. But anyway, I'm going to talk about pretty much the same sorts of things. So as Kate says, I'm a glaciologist or a glacier scientist, and lucky enough to spend at least part of my life in these kinds of environments. In this case, in the Swiss Alps here. Try it. So we have the same problem at work with these. They don't have line of sight. That's it. Okay, next slide then. Yeah, so I'm a senior lecturer, so that means that I'm sort of junior enough to be keen and enthusiastic and trying to sort of progress my career. I'm also old enough to be very cynical, and most of my teaching and research is in environmental science generally. Next click, please. It's worth remembering that academics like myself, and perhaps Rehema as well, we don't spend all of our time doing research. I'm supposed to spend about 30% of my time doing research, but it's usually a lot less than that. I have teaching to do, admin, outreach, and other public communication, which we get relatively little credit for, if any. Next click, please. But yeah, generally I'm a geoscientist. I work mostly on glaciers. This thing called geomorphology, it's just the study of how landscapes evolve over time, including through glacial processes. So much of Dundee's landscape, for example, has been sculpted by glaciers of the past. Climate change and this thing called geohazards, and I'll talk a little bit more about that anyway. Next click, please. And apparently I'm always carrying a pole wherever I go. This time I got this thing stranded, floating around, and the rule was if you got it stuck, well, you had to get it out again. So there we are. Okay, next slide, thanks. So this is kind of the general picture, really. I'm going to make a case that glaciers are important for two reasons, really. They're shrinking, and we need them, particularly for water resources. It's estimated that about 1 billion people globally are dependent, at least to some extent, on meltwater coming from glaciers. So we need glaciers to exist to melt a little bit, to supply water downstream for hydropower, for drinking water, and so on. And the other thing is that glaciers are shrinking, and that makes these kinds of landscapes more hazardous. So if you like, these landscapes are thawing. They're sort of loosening up. You have more landslides, more floods, become more dangerous sorts of environments. I'll talk later about, this is in Peru here. It's the largest tropical ice cap. It's the only tropical ice cap, in fact. And as these glaciers are shrinking, they're revealing these lakes, and these lakes can burst and wash away villages and infrastructure downstream. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about always do things in threes. So I'm going to talk about three, I suppose, studies or bits of work that I've been involved in that have perhaps got some kind of media attention. And the first one is this. It's about glacier change in Bolivia. So Bolivia, one of the Andean countries, so the spine of South America, the Andes mountain chain runs through Bolivia, and some of these mountains are up over 6,000 meters in elevation, and so cold enough to sustain glaciers. And the map here kind of shows the glaciers in orange as they were in 1986, and then we remapped that for 2014, and that's the blue shade here. And you can see that the blue shade, the more recent 2014 inventory, is much smaller than the 1986. And to cut a long story short, we showed that across Bolivia, so this is just one mountain range, there are two others sort of further south than this, which we're not showing on the slide here. Across this period, 1986 to 2014, these glaciers had lost about 40%, so it's 40% of their surface area. And that's significant. Again, these glaciers supply water for drinking water. They're an important part of the ecosystem locally. They drive hydropower in one or two places as well. And Bolivia has got a wet season and a dry season. These glaciers in the dry season are very important for water supply. But I suppose the other main thrust of our paper was that as these glaciers are kind of peeling back and receding, these lakes are emerging, as you can see in the images here. These lakes are emerging, and they're dammed up by natural dams. So glaciers tend to deposit sediment, and then they recede from that pile of sediment all this water is ponded up behind it. These are not carefully engineered dams, and they can burst. So you can have an avalanche into this lake, or a bit of ice breaks off of here and lands in this lake, or there's a landslide, something like that. And these lakes can then burst and unfortunately have killed thousands of people over the last decade in these so-called glacial lake outburst flood events. Next slide, please. Sort of coming forward in future, coming forward in history a little bit more. So that last study was from 2016, this one from 2021. This is a study about this catastrophic rock and ice avalanche that took place in the Uttarakhand region of the Himalaya in February last year. So in the midst of the full-on pandemic shutdown, really. This was a paper that we put together entirely through social media and Slack. So scientists, about 50 odd scientists working on this event together. So what happened was that a large chunk of rock and ice fell about 1,800 meters into the valley below, and then it cascaded down here. So the combination of rock and ice pulverized into water created this catastrophic flood. And if you press play on the top right, it should be a YouTube video, and it might just play. It's a little bit slow when I tried it before, so just give it one click and just leave it. If not, I can talk around it. You know what? Don't worry about it. It's okay. I can style it out. So what you would see here is this is just a massively turbulent. Thank you anyway. Really turbulent water flow. This was a hydropower station. So the irony here is that the Indian government have been sort of investing and building, or local governments, I should say, have been building these hydropower stations to become perhaps less dependent on fossil fuels. But now we're in a situation where warming in these high mountain regions is leading to these mountain collapses, and these floods that are generated that are trashing all of this renewable energy infrastructure. That's a little bit of a binary situation. It's more complicated than that. There were actually lots of problems with why they were building this here, and all sorts of damage they were doing in actually putting this hydropower station here anyway. But I'll gloss over that, and you can ask me later on if you want to. Next slide, please. And then finally, just to give you a sense of the sorts of things that I do, this paper here came out around about Christmas time last year. I was actually quite worried about it coming out at Christmas time because people's attention is not really on, what scientific papers are coming out. It's other things at that time of year. But this paper here sort of made the front of the Wall Street Journal. This is my colleague Martin here. It was on the front of the Wall Street Journal, which is quite funny. And what we were trying to show was that when you look at the long-term change in glaciers or the health of glaciers in the Himalaya compared to the last few decades, so sort of centuries compared to the last few decades, when you look over that sort of century scale, glaciers have melted at a much slower rate. And over the last few decades, they've been melting at an order of magnitude quicker. So about a factor of 10 times quicker in the last 2 or 3 decades than they have over the last 4 or 5 centuries. So again, that's a real indication that things are warming up. These glaciers are responding by melting much more quickly. And the Himalaya is particularly important for water supply, as I sort of alluded to earlier on. I'll just explain the map very, very briefly. You can for the simplicity, just ignore the size of these circles, but you've kind of got a gradient from east or from west to east here. These glaciers, or these sort of areas in sort of the east side here, they look a bit more red than these glaciers over here on the west. And that redness is basically showing the relative rate of, well, it's actually an absolute figure we've tried to here, but you can think of it as a relative rate of melt. So these glaciers over this side are melting much, much quicker than these glaciers up here. And indeed, just to make the point that actually the glaciers a little bit further off to the left-hand side here are actually thickening and advancing and growing. One of the few places in the world where that's happening. Next slide, please. So that's kind of me and what I do, and I don't know how long I've been talking now, probably too long, but sort of getting into the second half now. These are just a few things. So Kate neatly introduced a few sort of concerning issues, and I'm actually going to repeat at least one of those. So things that kind of worry me a little bit, and these are sort of things that are emerging as problems. So some of you might remember from early July, there was this ice avalanche in the Dolomites in Italy, and it was unclear exactly what had happened initially, and sadly this avalanche came through a group of climbers. They were all roped up. I think it kind of caught the rope and obviously killed several of these climbers. Really quite grim, because I think what they were doing to try and work out who was alive and who wasn't was going around the car parks trying to tie the number plates to people who may be dead or alive. So it's quite a really grim situation. But the cause of this was that this whole chunk of glacier ice, this whole part of a glacier, had simply detached from the mountain. And this is probably no coincidence that at the mountain summit the day before, this is over 3,300 meters above sea level, so roughly twice the height of Ben Nevis. This is, well, more than twice the height, in fact. The temperature here was about 10 degrees C in the day before, and this is all part of that kind of European heat wave, really. Now, if you'd have asked me a year ago how many of these events had ever happened, there was a paper published about a year ago saying that there were about 20 of these known glacier collapse events in total. There was this, and I can tell you that there's been this one. There's the previous slide I showed you earlier from the Uttarakhand region in the Himalaya. There was another one in, I think it was Kyrgyzstan this year, and another one in Chile. So there have been, within the space of the last about 15 months, there have been 4 of these. Whenever and before that, when you knew about 20 in total. So this seems to be an emerging threat. Glaciers just literally falling off mountains. Next slide, please. This really worries me. I spent a bit of my summer in the Swiss Alps this year, and you could see a lot of the glaciers just had no snow on them, which is really quite unusual. This guy here, Matthias Huss, he has 100% of his time on research. I'm very jealous of that, but he stood here on Europe's largest glacier. It's the Aletsch in Switzerland. And he's showing you his mass balance stake, so what he uses to measure the amount of melt. And this stake here is 6 meters. He's pretty tall. So 6 meters of thinning. This is actually the thickest ice in Europe. It's about 900 meters in thickness, but you can do the maths and work out how quickly this is melting away. And then this kind of shows you a slightly longer time record going back to 2000. And it's just showing you, red is bad, basically. These are years where you've had large losses of volume of ice in the Alps. And this year is the worst record, worst on record. So 6% or more than 6% ice volume loss in the Alps this summer. Next slide, please. This is where it becomes really important, I think. So it's not just glaciers, studying glaciers for the sake of glaciers, as on the last slide. This is where it becomes important. We talk about this thing called peak water. So you might think that in some parts of the world, they're dependent on glaciers for water. So if glaciers are melting more because the Earth is warming, that's a good thing, because they've got more water, it's more abundant. But the problem is that there comes a threshold known as peak water, where the glaciers become so small that they can no longer supply water at the same rate. And that inflection point, where you go from sort of abundance of water to bust, essentially, that's known as peak water. And this map here illustrates where on the world peak water may have happened, or where it's going to happen in the future. So if we go up into sort of Canada, North America, these sort of red dots here, this is showing you that these glaciers have passed peak water. They're now so small that they're no longer able to continue supplying water at the same rate. Not a tremendously well-populated area, so it's not a huge problem. But this area here, so the Himalaya, You can see some of the blues here indicate that peak water, we're okay really until the back end of this century. Those glaciers will continue, they're big enough to continue to supply water at the same rate. Thereafter, I think we have a problem. But some of these yellows indicate that time is coming where these glaciers, over much of the Himalaya in fact, are going to they're going to reach that peak water point. And that's when things become a little bit more scary in terms of water supply, hydropower, irrigation, and so on in these parts of the world. Next slide, please. Other things are around sort of extremes. So there are going to be a number of extremes. This isn't really what I spend a lot of my time doing. I was invited to talk to BBC Radio 4 about this, and you can follow the link here if you want to. I can just talk through it briefly. So this is an area, so Pakistan, floods, I think, Kate, you mentioned this in your introduction. And there were these immense monsoon rains this year. There was the point of this program was to kind of debunk the notion that 30%, a third of the country was covered in water. It wasn't, but it kind of doesn't matter. It was 10%, but even so, 30 odd million people displaced. But this is this is the Indus River. People are drawn to this area because it's an arid, semi-arid, and even hyper-arid area. People need to be near this river, and if this river is flooding, in this way every 10 years, and inundating this, up to 10% of the country, that's a very, very severe problem. And there's some sense that, some people have suggested that these rivers were already full from intense melting this year of some of the glaciers in the Karakoram further to the north, which perhaps compounded this problem. Next bit, please. So, as Kate suggested at the start, you want some kind of an unvarnished assessment of what I think about these sorts of things. So basically, my reaction is press the buzzer. Sort of a grimace emoticon, and the next again, thanks. So, I mean, I'd sort of count myself as sad but pragmatic. That's kind of my overall reaction to these things. So this is in New Zealand, actually, just out of interest. So these are glaciers kind of diminishing over time. When you open up, your issue of the Journal of Glaciology or similar, a lot of the papers in there are really just documenting glaciers shrinking and the problems associated with that. But I think there is a sense that, we need to look for solutions. And I try to remain positive about that, in that there's a lot of good work that can still be done to try and help people, even though glaciers are shrinking, water supplies might be becoming more insecure and so on. So next slide, please. One of the things, as I was talking to Tanya, can't see where she is there, about what sorts of things I might want to talk about in this talk. So one of the other things I do a lot of is talk to the media, and the common question that you get from the media is such and such an event, Pakistan floods, bits of glacier falling off a mountain, related to climate change? And I think most people like me, scientists, generally have to be a bit careful. I think we accept that we can be wrong, that we can. So my stock answer is usually we can't link any one single event directly as a consequence of climate change, but when you look at a whole series of events over time, it's a bit of a smoking gun. And certainly, if I were to put my money on whether that Pakistan flood situation was made worse by climate change, I'd say yes. Is it more likely that bits of glaciers are falling off of mountains because of climate warming? I'd say yes. But in the media, you have to be a little bit more careful, I think. If you can put the next slide on. I kind of lost it with this one a little bit. Well, I say lost it, it's about as much as I ever lose it. So I was actually on fieldwork in Switzerland when I got a call from a journalist from the National talking about this. And it was this group of the usual suspects, Lord Monckton and others, they've got their sort of think tank. There's not much thinking going on. So they had put out this declaration saying that there's no climate emergency and that governments shouldn't be making policy on the basis of there being rapid climate change. If you just put on the next click, thanks. So I was quoted as saying that this was anti-science and they should be ignored. And I think, why did I say that? I think basically the worst thing as a scientist is to be ignored. You publish a paper and no one cites it. That's like the biggest. If you get cited a lot, it might be that your work is great or it could be terrible, but often bad science gets ignored. And I think the same applies here. I think these guys should just be ignored. I was kind of saying to the journalist, why are you even giving them a platform? But there we are. And I just sort of said, I'd been in the Alps for a week and a half. I'd seen all these glaciers shrinking away, no snow on them, full of Saharan dust on the top. Didn't really look very healthy at all. So I just said it's a lazy declaration, no supporting information. These people are, I wanted to say crackpots, but their views are fringe. So this is me losing it, right? This is me getting as emotional as I get on these sorts of things. Next thing, thanks. And one of the reasons I have to be very careful is that, as I alluded to earlier, a lot of the time I'm working on ice avalanches, rock avalanches, and catastrophic floods. And although, logic dictates that the Earth is warming up, mountain regions are warming up, glaciers are shrinking, these kind of mountain regions are thawing away, I have to be careful because, these sorts of risks and hazards, people's lives are affected by this. But if I make the wrong call and I start saying you should move because this lake here is going to burst and wash away your village, well, that's very easy for me to say that, but these people may have an emotional connection to this area. Some people in parts of the world deify these mountain regions. I could get it wrong. Maybe I am too overzealous in my assessment of risk, and you move these people out of these, or you suggest that these people might want to move out of these regions, and then 20, 30 years later, there hasn't been a landslide, there hasn't been a catastrophic flood. People's lives and livelihoods are dependent on this, and there are some situations where scientists have been too alarmist, and and policies have been developed around, say, not developing hydropower or developing hydropower, or suggesting people might move out of areas based on science that ultimately hasn't come to be true. So next slide, please. So that's basically the reason why I'm very cautious. And again, thanks. So I just wanted to, this is kind of, I think it's my last slide pretty much, but it's just a few sort of things that may be worth discussing later, but I'm happy not to as well. So some barriers to doing science and some of the limitations as a scientist. The obvious one is time. I've kind of talked about that already. Next one, thank you. Foreign aid cuts. So, I was lucky enough to have a foreign aid budget funded project a couple of years ago, and those projects got cut. So I was lucky. I was kind of coming towards the end of mine, but other people just had theirs. They had the funding agreements, and then the funding cuts were made, and global Britain wasn't so global anymore. Next bit. Keeping up, this is a bit mundane, keeping up the sheer volume of science. Progression as an academic, so people like myself are, the way that we're assessed isn't all, is supposed to be about quality and impact and excellence. And I can perhaps unpick this a little bit later on, but just for time, I'll just say that the pressures on scientists, and I'm talking as an academic scientist, someone who does teaching and other things as well, are not always conducive to helping solve some of the world's problems. Move on to the next bit. So you showed the Nature Climate Change journal earlier on. Look up how much it costs to publish in Nature Climate Change, and then consider that a lot of scientists don't have research funding. I don't have any active grants at the minute, because it's ridiculous trying to get, it's extremely competitive to get scientific funding. And publishers, I mean, this is a whole other thing really. It's daylight robbery really. The amount of money that you either have to pay to publish, or that the university library has to pay to publish, it's crazy. Next, thanks. There are huge inequalities in science, complete underrepresentation of female academics, people from different ethnicities in senior positions, and this is a huge problem. And the next bit as well. And again, I mean, I haven't watched Frozen Planet. I know one of the people who was in it very well. He used to be my boss. And there's other sort of similar sorts of programs. There's a new movie out, I think, called Into the Ice. And there's been a lot of pushback by other glaciologists on these sorts of programs on social media, because it kind of portrays this sort of very heroic glaciologist. I can say I am not a heroic glaciologist. I'm quite happy being very safe in the field. I don't like to be dangled down on a rope into the middle of the Greenland ice sheet. And actually, I think a lot of the time you don't need to be doing that. And it's actually not very safe. And it portrays an image of glaciology and science that is that you've got to be tough, you've got to be macho, you've got to be doing dangerous things to be a scientist, and you don't. And you can do it quite happily from the comfort of your computer screen or elsewhere. And I think that this is just interesting. I've not actually, as like I say, I've not actually seen the most recent Frozen Planet, but I think that there's been a lot of my colleagues have seen it and told me they've just switched it off after 10 minutes, because it was a rather sort of macho image of what glaciology is or isn't. Thanks. And the next one, etc., etc. And I think that's it. That's it. I think that's with me done. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thanks very much for asking me. It's not very often I come across the bridge this side of the world. So, and thanks to June for kind of pushing me across the bridge there. So my name's Rehema White. I'm an academic at the University of St Andrews. I've been there about 15 years. Before that, I worked at Centre for Ecology and Hydrology as a scientist. And prior to that, I worked in South Africa for 10 years. And prior to that, I was in Australia, and before that, Mexico, and before that, I was in Africa as well for 10 years. So I've worked in lots of different parts of the world. And it was when I was working in Africa, I went out and I was very interested in biodiversity conservation. I was interested in conserving the forests there and in conserving the wildlife species that were in the forest. And I very quickly realized that in the areas we were working, actually people depended on those forests. And even though we were working with state forests, and even though it was illegal for people to actually access those forests, they needed the resources from those forests, and they understood those forests, and they, at that point, had no say in the governance of those forests. So my views on conservation and biodiversity conservation really changed over that period of time. And I went to the Johannesburg Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002, and I thought, this is my tribe of people. This is recognizing that we want biodiversity conservation, but we also have to think about social justice, and we also have to think about how local and indigenous groups actually have a say in the way that we manage some of those resources, which they think of as home, as being their nature, as being their culture and identity. So that was how I got into sustainable development originally. I came back to the UK, and I've been at St Andrews now about 15 years, running or more recently contributing to the Sustainable Development Programme. And I'm also chair of the United Nations University Regional Centre of Expertise in Education for Sustainable Development of Scotland, which is that whenever we need a fancy title, we kind of pull that one out. But essentially what it is it's a great bunch of people. It's a network organisation called Learning for Sustainability Scotland, hosted down in Edinburgh, but folk all across Scotland and beyond. I'm going to talk about that a wee bit later. So can I have the next slide, please? So I was asked to talk when I'm here a little bit about what my research involves, and how does my research actually address and engage with the climate and nature crises. How does this affect me, and then how do I respond? So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the sort of broad framing of my research. I'm going to unpack, sort of, rather than looking at lots of different things, I'm going to really unpack one project to try and explain how it is that I work. And then I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about how I respond to that in different kinds of ways. And it's fantastic that we did it in this order. I'm really pleased, because I think we've had the sort of proper science first. And I was a scientist, but I got really frustrated with that role in some kinds of ways. So I've shifted much more into social science and trying to get people together to be able to address some of these kinds of solutions. But we absolutely need the pure science. We need the people measuring glaciers. So that's, I'm glad we've done that first. Right, next slide, please. So for a different talk, I was actually asked to highlight what I thought 3 of the biggest issues were in relation to sustainable development. Climate change is not on here, it is implicit. Because for me, one of the massive issues that we're actually facing at the moment is biodiversity loss, because it is going at a massive rate, but people tend to think that we've resolved it, because we have quite a lot of legislation, and we've had legislation for a long time, and people have recognised biodiversity as a positive thing. So this is an area where I have a lot of concerns, and both professionally and at a kind of emotional level. Secondly is about injustice, and during COP I went to go and see a talk by a young black activist who was talking about how when they had some activists meeting together, she was the one that was kind of cut out the photograph. And it was a kind of interesting symbol for how sometimes people from certain groups are invisible in certain kinds of debates. And so not only are we seeing social injustice on the ground, but their voices are not always being heard the same. And the last is actually relates to overconsumption, and the picture here represents the distribution of plastic nodules, which are now everywhere across the world. And it's because of the way we have been consuming at great rates, and then the way pollution is going out across the world. I might come back to these, or we can come back to these in the discussion later, but yeah, I have big concerns about these areas and others. Next slide. So what does my research involve? Next slide. So it's framed by these sort of 2 different aspects in a sense. One is the fact that we have undeniably massive crises in which we're sitting at the moment. And one of the ways I like to talk to my students about this is that we are overstepping planetary boundaries. So glacier loss is one aspect of this, biodiversity loss is one aspect, the impacts of climate change, the impacts of pollution. We're actually going beyond what our planet can actually deal with in relation to some of these issues. But at the same time, we have increasing inequalities, and we have real issues around social justice. So those sort of 2 major and interconnected aspects cause us to have to do something. But I'm actually quite a glass half full person, and I'm probably a bit of I always like to try to find a way to move forward. And so I always, when I am talking to students, try to have also the hope, the ways in which we can make the world a better place. And there are many examples of solutions of how people are doing that in different kinds of ways. So accepting absolutely the part on the left, but moving forward with different kinds of solutions. Next slide, please. So it's quite hard to sort of describe your research in one bit, but this is sort of roughly, there's 3 elements to it. So the first thing I think I'm interested in is knowledge and sustainable development. And it's kind of the stuff that Simon was talking about, the way media take stories and move stories, the way people think they know things, but they don't. How do people learn things? How do people exchange knowledge? How do we get scientific knowledge into practitioner knowledge? How do we make the decisions about whether to move a village or not? How do we involve the people in the village in that risk assessment process? So that idea of knowledge, particularly how we do research and how we work across disciplines, and how we learn, how we encourage learning, not just in formal settings, but informal settings too. The second aspect I'm really interested in is governance, particularly of what we sometimes call natural resources, and particularly the role that communities play in that. And with communities also, sometimes NGOs, like Extinction Rebellion or other NGOs I've mostly worked with. And because I've worked quite a lot in Africa and in Mexico, I've got I still have some projects that are looking at global north-south links as well. It's very easy to get quite theoretical and publish lots of papers, so I also like to stay involved in practice. And fairly recently, we had lots of interventions in golf. At the moment, we're working quite a lot with plant health. So we're working with people in policy world, we're working with practitioners, we're working with a whole range of different kinds of academics to help ensure that the legislation that is coming in, the practices that are coming in, are reducing the spread of pests, pests and pathogens, particularly in relation to trees. You all know we've had Dutch elm disease. You all know we've got ash dieback. Unfortunately, there's other ones on the horizon, so we're trying to understand that and find ways to address it. I won't talk about that unless there's any questions today, though. So I'm really interested in linking across the natural and social sciences. And I'm really interested in, as an academic, helping to gather groups of people to try and collectively develop solutions to some of these problems, sometimes at local level and sometimes at global level as well. Can I get the next slide, please? So what do I actually do in my research? Can I get the next slide, please? I thought I'd talk to you about this project because we're just finishing this project off and I thought it might be of interest to you. So the project is funded by Erasmus+, which unfortunately is no longer open to us in the same kind of way after Brexit. It's a European project, so we have European partners in Germany and Norway and other parts of the world too. And it's called Eco-Village Transition in Action, Communication, Cooperation and Collaboration Beyond Community. The idea with it is that there's loads of excellent stuff that goes on in communities, but sometimes it's sort of kept at that level. It's kept at a local level. So how do we scale that kind of fantastic example and the great things that are happening at community level beyond that? Sometimes we have local authorities wanting to engage with communities at community level, but not quite know how to do it. So this project was about saying, particularly if you get communities and local authorities to work together, what can you do that helps scale up some of the practices that are ongoing? We had a whole range of different partners, and here's my research question. So for this project, we wanted to, first of all, sort of say, so how do we scale up the kind of regenerative practices that are happening at community level? And the picture on the right is actually from Tondorf, Schloss Tondorf, which is a castle in Germany. And one of the things they're doing in Germany at the moment is they're buying up old castles and making them into eco-villages, which is something we could learn about in Scotland here. And so a group of very committed individuals are trying to restore this old castle and live in it. Like people living in the grounds and various kinds of habitation. And when you look down across the valley, they're starting to have an impact way beyond their sort of castle grounds. So they've got a community supported agriculture section down the bottom. They're just building a new school, not just for people living in the eco-village, but for people all round about. They're bringing in new jobs, new kind of eco-ventures into this particular area and creating a little sort of green hub of entrepreneurship. And the municipality is really delighted about it. And they're also able to start galvanizing some of the more sustainable transport links as well. So they've got bicycle lanes going in, they've got a say around the local bus stop and so on. So that's an example where that community is doing quite a lot, but wants to scale up all the way along that valley floor. Secondly, how do we implement and embed local authority sustainability strategies in communities? I don't know if anyone here works for a local authority. Yeah. So we could talk later, but local authorities actually have a statutory requirement to do many things in support of sustainable development, but sometimes it's quite hard for them within the structures that exist to know how to engage people in community and how to push that forward. So that can be quite a complicated thing. Finally, how do we then support these kind of thriving collaborations to put all these things together, involving other actors sometimes as well? And behind this are some of the things that, really pick up on what Kate started off talking about at the beginning. We've got this urgent situation. It's all very well talking about nice collaboration and people restoring castles, but we have this crisis which is ongoing at the moment. You see these glaciers falling off hills. So we have this real urgent need to act, but people often don't want to act urgently. They want to do so by nudging and shifting the mainstream slowly. So we have these sort of radical versus mainstream, urgent versus long-term relationship building processes we need to think about. And we have some people wanting change very fast and other people resisting, sometimes just against change, not against specific change. And we also have these issues at what scale is it best that we start to tackle these, at local or regional or global, or how do we work that out? Next slide, please. So just very briefly, we did a bunch of interviews, we did a whole range of different tools, we had lots of different workshops. There was a lot of work that went into this. I can come back to that if you need. Next slide. So with the interviews that we did, we spoke to 22 people who were already undertaking projects of different kinds around the world, where community action was linking up beyond community level. And we asked them, why did you do it? What were your motivations? And we asked them, what did you find? Like, what helped your project be at least a partial success? Because we knew all of these people were doing quite good things. So what we tried to do was gather good practice. And so this is what they told us that they needed to do, or that we needed to do, and that they had to do to get some of their projects to work. So with regard to motivation, often there's inspiration from examples elsewhere. So this idea of publishing as an academic, in academic journals, yeah, we've got to do all of that, but also trying to work with others to produce handbooks that are accessible in different kinds of language, and websites and podcasts and all of those other kind of funky things. Those are really important for people to pick up on things and be inspired by. Sometimes people were inspired by theory, and sometimes they were inspired by one particular practical thing they wanted to do: provide food, educate their kids, something, or build a tiny house, cycle safely into the next village. Sometimes they started with quite small practical things as well. But in all cases, there was something that led it from going beyond the individual into developing a common dream. And sometimes there was the idea of going beyond a community, creating not only a community, but a whole village with different communities. And so sort of celebrating the diversity that you can get, not trying to go off and be one secluded, separated little eco-village, but rather trying to change within wider society. Again, one of those questions we can talk about. Often with these projects, it was just the right thing at the right time in the right place. Next slide, please. Okay, one of these horrendous slides. You can just look at the right-hand side if you want and see what the quotes are. So when it came to collaboration lessons, we had this really interesting thing where a lot of the collaboration occurs between human beings. And human beings get on with each other as human beings. And we all know during the COVID pandemic, it was really hard to engage sometimes in these online events. When we meet, we can understand each other sometimes more easily, and we can listen to each other in a very different way. And so listening carefully, talking with respect and care, being really positive, celebrating small successes were really important, and one individual said. One individual said, actually, it's about using we instead of I. Instead of coming along to a local authority or some other potential partner and saying, I need this, in my community, I need this, is to say, what can we do together to try to make this region a better place? Giving space and time to bring people together to generate and share understanding. So sometimes that was actually virtual space, because one of the great things about virtual space is you don't have to travel somewhere to be able to attend. So it actually does increase the number of people who can attend a particular event, even if they're interacting in a different kind of way. So spaces that are physical, but also spaces that are virtual, were seen to be really important. And again, sometimes it was this idea of speed. Knowing when you really need to push, you really need to say, this is urgent, we cannot wait, we absolutely have to do something about this, and when you need to have a wee bit more patience. And when we looked at some of these factors overall, we could see there were issues around people and the interactions between people, issues around practices and practices that could be undertaken to better deliver and develop collaboration, and issues around processes, and sometimes those were processes that the local authority had some responsibility for. Next slide, please. I'm not sure if this looks better in a sort of extended slide or worse in a kind of extended slide. So we start to map out who's involved and who can collaborate, because although the project was sort of written as communities collaborating with local authorities, anybody who's done anything in relation to sustainability action knows that it's not always that simple. So on this diagram on the left-hand side, we've got a kind of scale issue where an individual comes into this in some kind of way. And then we have households that can intervene. We can have sort of projects that can be there. Sometimes communities have small NGOs in them that run projects, like transition groups, for example. But sometimes it can be a whole community. And then we have the regional level, and then we have things happening at a global level. And we have different stakeholders that can be involved at all these different levels. So particularly when it comes to NGOs and civil society, we can have quite small projects sometimes that can be really important to sort of galvanize people to come together and to do things. And, you know, the importance of those should never be underestimated. You know, stimulating just a few people can do a huge amount. But also these link right up to what's happening at a global scale, where you might have the WWF and the Greenpeace. And, you know, Extinction Rebellion would certainly be an example of a global level organization that manifests at regional and local levels as well. But at the same time, then you have the government and the public sector, and you have global UN type organizations, but you also come down to the regional level. Universities and some of these other institutions sit in quite interesting in between places and could play a really important role, but don't always choose to step into that. And so that again is a discussion about, you know, what is the role of universities in today's world. And then you also have business, and sometimes business is bashed as being a bad thing, and sometimes it can be, but sometimes we can have really positive social enterprises, or we can have really positive examples where businesses are trying to engage with local communities and to do good things. And what's really important is all the interactions between these, and they stopped me putting more arrows in this diagram because they said it looked more complicated, but there should be arrows everywhere, because you can have these different bodies interacting at all different kinds of levels. And I've got nature underpinning that, because I think the environments in which we live and the way we engage with nature are really important to supporting the way that we collaborate with each other as well. Next slide. So just thinking a wee bit more broadly about some of the results from this particular project, from the ethnographic visits that we did, from the workshops we did with different people, from the interviews, from developing the toolkits, there were some ideas that kind of emerged that I think are really important. One is this idea of, when we talk about scaling up sustainability action and regenerative practices, what are we actually meaning? What kind of scaling might that be? So there might be a magnitude in terms of how many people are involved, how many hectares of forest are saved, which kind of goes from the human to global scale. There might also be a sort of spatial element to that in some cases, but sometimes we are working virtually. Sometimes it's a temporal scale, and you know, we've really seen the rhetoric around sustainable development change since I first got to the University of St Andrews, where it was quite a sort of radical, different, edgy sort of thing for us to be doing, and now it's really mainstream, and we're constantly having that sort of to push the edge of where we want to take it. Sometimes it could be numerical. We can think about it grounding in place, strengthening something rather than maybe making it bigger. And sometimes this idea of taking over social infrastructures. So standing as a councillor sometimes is a fantastic way. Community council in the UK is not always seen as being a way to get radical change, but in some other places in Europe it can be. Next slide, please. So we also had some really interesting lessons that emerged around collaboration, and I've kind of reduced these into just a few sort of phrases here. One was this idea of human scale and communication, is that although we're talking about collaboration between bodies, between institutions and bodies and organizations, communities and local authorities, or the UN and eco-villages at a global level, we are essentially talking about human interactions, and so understanding and making space for human emotions and human motivations is really important. Having a good idea and a visionary idea based on local needs was something that really helped push some of these ideas forward. The second idea is something much bigger, and that's thinking about transformation. That's not just thinking about making something a wee bit bigger, but actually starting to shift society from being the way it is, a bit more so or a bit less so, into something radically different. And there was a talk from our participants thinking about the scale at which transformation might actually occur. Also thinking about the intermediary institutions that you sometimes need to galvanize much more collaboration, to think about how goals and visions can be transformed over time, and to think about how people and processes can actually be transformed. And then also thinking about conflict. So conflict can sometimes actually be a good thing, because when conflict arises, it is because there's seen to be the need for change. And sometimes conflict is a sign that change is required, and therefore something has to be done to overcome it. Next slide, please. So have we got the wee... This is going to be fun. Okay, so I'm going to explain this diagram to you because I love this diagram. Okay, so down at what this is basically doing is it's one model of suggesting how we might get sustainability transformation. Transformation of our world in such a way that we are not trashing the biodiversity, that we are trying to tackle climate change, that we are trying to work together on these in ways that address social injustice and tackle the problems of overconsumption and biodiversity loss I first mentioned. So that's what this is kind of aiming at. This is a sort of model of how it might occur. It's called the multi-level perspective, and it's promoted by Giles and his colleagues, and there's quite a lot of critiques of it, but most people think it's quite valid. So down the wee left-hand side there, we've got what we call niche innovations, and that can be really fantastic stuff that's happening at a local level. It might be a community-supported garden. It might be a meeting of people like this. It might be the Raptor interest group. It's contexts where people are getting together and they're trying out new things, and they're starting to talk about things, and they're starting to change the way in which they do things. Some of the ideas from that can then be scaled up, all right, across local authority areas by getting into local authorities say, wow, this community is doing a great thing. They've got a community garden. Everyone needs to have a community garden. Let's give out lots more allotments places. Let's have a community garden officer at the local authority who's going to try and help everyone to get into this kind of thing. So you can have that kind of scaling up into what's called the socio-technical regime. But you can also have the local authority having ideas that feed down into local level and sort of saying, well, you know, we actually think we need more sustainable transport, so let's try and encourage everyone to do cycling. Let's team up with Sustrans and let's try and see what we can actually get to have happen there. So you've got some interaction happening here. But one of the difficult things is trying to get the socio-technical, the kind of regional level stuff to shift into socio-technical landscape change, which is really societal transformation. And quite often what happens is we have these kind of parallel processes that occur. It's quite difficult to shift up. It's quite difficult from ideas that are happening at a global level to kind of come down to this level or even down to local level. So what we're looking for in our community work is for these innovations to kind of nudge up and to shift what's happening at a wider level and then to feed up as well as part of societal transformation. Next slide, please. Right, so this is really, I've lost track of where I am timing, but I'm almost done. That's the project that I wanted to speak to you about. Increasingly over time, I think I've spent more of my time not actually doing research and doing some of these other things that we're supposed to do. So I love my teaching, but I'm also involved in this organisation, Learning for Sustainability Scotland. And I think that learning is absolutely fundamental to us tackling these crises. And that's because learning is transformational for people. And when people are transformed, they engage in these different kinds of initiatives and they inspire and they make these little niche innovations happen. And they're really important as change agents for helping to get that societal transformation. When we're talking about learning for sustainability, therefore, we talk about three things. One is the transformational element of it, and nobody can say it better than Mandela. And one is the kind of range of topics that we cover, which is not just environmental issues, but it's the connections between all of these. We can talk about the SDGs as an example. But the other is this focus on competencies, not just on people acquiring information, but on people acquiring the knowledge, yes, but also the skills, capacities and competencies to be those change agents. And so that involves things like being able to understand systems, so that what happens if a bit of a glacier drops off? What's that going to mean for the water further downstream and for the people down there, and therefore for the agriculture and the biodiversity? Future thinking, being able to imagine what the future could be and to understand how the past affects what our futures might be. Critical thinking, to be really critical about the information that comes out. This think tank in London, they've got absolutely nothing that supports their declaration that this is not a climate emergency. Being able to critically assess that themselves in this kind of way. Strategic, being able to make plans, get through and deliver them. Collaborative, being able to work together, all this respect and empathy that we talked about in our project just now. Integrated problem solving, self-awareness, being aware of oneself and how one works. And normative skills, being able to appreciate different kinds of cultures. Oops, next slide, please. I thought this was a clicker. So Learning for Sustainability Scotland is something I put quite a lot of time in because we work with a whole range of different kinds of organisations to support this around Scotland and beyond. I can talk to that if needed. Next slide, please. Right, the last bit. How do I react to these crises? Next slide, please. So the first thing I think for me is that I like to think in systems. I don't only think about climate change, but how all of these different things interact with each other. And that's partly because in my job, I have to teach a whole range of different topics and I have to work with students on different kinds of elements. But also when I work in the field with people, their lives don't just divide up into these nice little neat SDGs. They're very much around problems which are complex, uncertain and have to be addressed in different kinds of ways. Next slide, please. I think I deal with the problems by trying to focus on positive ways forward. The problems are there, and I do lose sleep over them sometimes. But I think probably I like the sort of term pragmatist because I spend a lot of my time now trying to say, okay, how are we going to use technology to move forward a little bit? How are we going to work with different people? How can my work help ensure that different people's voices are heard in some of these debates that are ongoing? How can I work with the next generations and ensure that, you know, my children and my children's children will, if they ever get to that stage, will have a better world or inherit a world that isn't too bad at least. Next slide, please. But there's the other element as well, I think, and that's the personal one. And I think it is, we hear a lot about academics burning out. We hear a lot about activists burning out. And I count myself as being an activist and an academic and an advocate, actually, for policy. And I think one of the things that's really important for me is to connect with nature. So I spend a lot more time walking outside now. The dog is very happy. I spend quite a lot of time with people I like now, and I make that happen regardless of how many papers I should be writing. So there's a group of us that will meet sometimes and undertake different kinds of activities. And the kind of Joanna Macy activities are really important in that. Noticing the small things in life and never kind of forgetting the fun side. One of my sons has just carved this pumpkin. And so, you know, kind of also not forgetting to be funny and to be human in all of this as well. Next slide, please. Yep. So I do research partly to understand the crises, but more to understand how people can address the crises. And most of my research is now action research, bringing people together to try and address these different issues. It is quite hard being an academic with all the conflicting things that are around us, as well as feeling it at an individual level. But I do really think that we can all engage with the Hope That Reconnects and Joanna Macy type activities. Actually, next slide, please, and I'll finish on that. Yeah, there's lots of other people that get involved in this work, and many of them are a great bunch of people as well. Thanks. And visit the local school. It's really hard work engaging community that doesn't want to be engaged. And sometimes it takes a long time. But communities are sort of, just thinking back to when I did some work here with groups in Fife, one of the things that the community groups that we worked with had found successful was doing celebrations. People didn't want to come to things that talked about crises. They wanted to come to the stuff that talked about the positive futures. So as an example, how a Fife transition, when they got most people involved, it was having a food festival. They had a free puppet show in the hall. And Cecilia came and sold her jam, and there was a local farmer who sold some tatties, and loads of people came together. There was a bunch of straw in the middle of the park so the kids could all play, and that brought lots and lots of people in. And then while they were there, they captured them to fill out a couple of little, you know, do you want this or this? You know, what do you think about this? And tried to capture a little bit of the feeling around it. But I agree, it's never always the same community, and communities will have different views. If you want big change, it takes a lot of effort to get communities on board.
Thanks, Rehema. Anybody else? Tanya, go ahead.
Tanya's question was about trust. I suppose for me that would be trust between scientists and the communities whose work they affect. But perhaps it might be different in the kind of context that you're working in. So, I mean, you're going to know better than me because your PhD's kind of on these kind of things. But for other people, one of the slides I showed earlier on was I think it was like a GIF image of an ice cap in Peru, and it's there's a well documented if you know the circles, if you travel in the same circles. But there was a well documented situation there where there's a world famous glaciologist who's been going up onto that ice cap and measuring how much it's melting year on year for decades now, and has published lots of high profile papers. But his scientific team were actually chased out of there a couple of years ago because they had brought in people to carry their equipment from an outside company, and it had really annoyed the locals, and indeed the locals had actually blamed the scientists themselves. They were sort of saying, well, you're drilling all of these corers and things into the glacier, and that's what's causing it to shrink away. So whatever powers that be have been irritated by these scientific experiments and so on. So there, and I can talk about other examples of this where local communities have although the science that you're trying to do ultimately should help them, that those communities turn against the scientists, sabotage equipment and so on. So in this most recent project that we had, which was funded through the UK foreign aid, we have tried to engage local communities before we've gone out and done any data collection, and the best way of doing that is to work with scientists in country. One of the problems with and I count myself in this at times is that with scientists is that we tend to go to Iceland, or we tend to go to Peru or wherever, and we collect our data and then we publish it with our mates here in the UK, and there's no kind of involvement at all with scientists in the host country, and that's particularly problematic for British glaciology because we don't have any glaciers. So I think working with local scientists and social scientists in our case, and then those scientists went into different villages and talked to them a bit about their experiences with climate change, with glacier change, how all of that was affecting them. They kind of laid the groundwork for teams of scientists coming in to try and employ local people on fieldwork expeditions. So you kind of there's a little bit of financial kickback to people locally if you're going to go into their, if you're kind of coming through their community and then going on to the glaciers to study them, why not employ some of those people as part of that work? And I think so far, I mean, our project is kind of at the wrapping up stage, so maybe ask me in a year's time how this has all gone, but I think it's been in this particular project based in Peru, it's been a more positive experience through, if you like, sort of co-working or co-creating some of that information. I've spoken for about 5 minutes now.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Trust came up a lot in our project around collaboration, and at first everybody was like, "Well, this is so obvious, we shouldn't include it." But I think it came up a lot because trust is really difficult. And trust is not something we should take for granted. It is something you need to work towards. And I think it manifests differently, and we consider it differently at different levels. So at an institutional level, it is really important that if there has been, particularly when we start talking about sort of decolonization of the curriculum or decolonization of conservation and other processes, is we need to have apologies. And we need to have a recognition of what's happened in the past before you can start thinking about what happens now. So at those sort of macro scales, there are really big issues to address. But what we also found was that then trust is really important at the individual level, and that collaborations are often ultimately between these few people in this project and these few people in this institution, and that there has to be a way of these people being able to trust each other, and they have to come into their process with integrity. And if they don't, then that collaboration is not going to work. So there's a whole kind of set of principles. So the collaborations that we knew that were successful, they usually had some kind of contractual element eventually, and they were in order to ensure that principles were upheld and that integrity was there. And that's problematic in some places and some institutions. I also think just a comment there on trust is in relation to community approaching a local authority. So I had a colleague or friend in the Netherlands, and the Netherlands is a little bit more out there sometimes, and the people who work for the local authority, although obviously we have amazing people who work for the local authority here. But and so from the eco-village that they were developing there, they would take two people to the local authority to speak to them. One would be very formally dressed, kind of sort of middle-aged woman, grey hair, looking very respectable, quite formally dressed, and one would be a very young, far more funky-looking individual. And when they went in there, depending on who they spoke to, one or other of them would do the main speaking. And that was because trust is often easier with people you identify with initially, and to get that initial stage. And then once you have that initial link, then you can deepen it. So there were some really interesting stories that came out about trust and about how to make that work. But yeah, integrity, absolutely fundamental, and thinking about local people in the long term.
That sounds like quite a devious way to get trust. Really thinking about it hard. Anybody else? Sure, go ahead.
Start with that one, because I'm worried I'll forget. I think the question was really, if I can summarise quickly, would be challenges for both developing and developed countries in terms of hydroelectricity. Yeah, okay. Yes, that there are. I mean, yeah, both situations. I mean, at the end of the day, the base problem is climate change in both cases. I don't know so much about Norway. I can perhaps talk a bit more authoritatively about Switzerland and elsewhere. So in places where climate change is melting glaciers, perhaps leading to less snowfall in the winter, and the problems there associated with how that affects hydropower sustainability. I mean, I saw a paper a couple of years ago where led by one of the Swiss research science groups, so Swiss government funded, where they were talking about damming, or theoretically damming all of the mountain valleys in Switzerland, and how much water they could store behind those dams as a replacement for glaciers. So glaciers are an important water store, but they're not going to be there, in the next, beyond about 100 years or so. So what are you going to do to fill that storage gap? And they have the paper in Nature with pictures just showing whole valleys just being dammed up, and to some extent they are doing that in a couple of places. So they're thinking about using some hard engineering really to try and get around some of that. I mean, some of it is a bit theoretical. I can't imagine that people would be tremendously happy about just damming up valleys left, right, and centre. But that is a problem. And the situation I showed you the paper in the Uttarakhand region, where so I think the Indian government has got quite an ambitious program to try and develop hydropower, but actually it's Tanya's other supervisor who's in law, friend colleague of mine, Andrew Allen, in the law school at Dundee, has been looking into this. And you've then got sort of devolvement to sort of it's a federal system in India, so then federal governments have obviously a stake in what goes on and a say in what goes on locally. So sometimes that sort of national kind of program doesn't always get translated at the state level, and then there's kind of local level beyond that. And in this particular case, so there's kind of a governance issue. And then I think in this particular case, it was a terrible place to build a hydropower station. So actually, this event that I showed, where there's sort of ice and landslide into the valley bottom, had happened at least twice before, and they've still developed 2 power stations in that valley. And the reason that this particular one was so catastrophic was that there were people building, that they were in the kind of the tunnels beneath, where the turbines are meant to go in. This hydropower scheme was under construction at the time that this big sort of cascade of water and mud came down the valley, and that's what killed a couple of hundred people in this event, because they just got buried alive in these tunnels. So that's why it was a terrible place to build it. But even before that, they were chopping down trees and creating a lot of mess anyway in an area that was already environmentally very sensitive. So it's this kind of tension between wanting to do things to try and make your future power supply a bit more sustainable, but doing it in a way that doesn't put yourself and your environment in danger. So yeah, but two quite different responses in these two different countries. You had a second question? So I think that if I can summarise the question then for the audience, that it's about how much time should people like ourselves be devoting to doing fundamental sort of blue skies research versus more like sort of impactful on the ground research, impactful to people, or have I? Yeah, I'll try and keep my response fairly short, and then I think, because it probably lends itself more to your kind of work. I mean, I personally, I think that we still do need to quantify changes and to provide that basic science. I take your point that we already know enough. We know that we're screwed, right? But it's good to it's still useful to know how much we're screwed and over what kind of time scale, and some of the things that we find out still might have a chance of shocking people, governments in particular, and policymakers occasionally. But I think a common thread from both our talks was that we're pragmatic and want to find solutions to things. And I can tell you that I have moved a long way in my career from, I won't give you my whole career history, but I've moved a long way from doing pure science to doing things that have more of a crossover with people, social scientists, that try and deal with more deal with the problem from different angles, working with different people. But I actually think it might be one for you to answer as well.
Yes, I think there's 3 things there. Firstly, we actually don't know what we need to know, so we always need some pure science, and that feeds in different ways. I'll come back to that in a minute. Secondly, is that it's not like knowledge just stops. So the world is changing, and humans are changing what they do within that world, and we need to keep on exploring that and understanding what's happening in relation to that. And in relation to climate change in particular, I think that the rhetoric has shifted a lot from mitigation to adaptation, particularly in the global south. So the people that I work with in Mexico are smallholders who are really struggling. They don't have enough food because the rains are really late, and if they come, sometimes they come as floods, and they don't have the kind of double rains that they used to have. So they're having to actually shift away from the crops that they've grown for generations and starting to think about what they can do differently. And sometimes that means moving away from the areas that to which they are indigenous. So we need to keep on finding, exploring what's happening there and working with them to co-create solutions for adaptation, whether that is moving away or trying to grow different crops or grow crops at different times of year, or use different technologies to try and create sand dams and keep some moisture in their areas in different kinds of ways. So we always need research, I think, of different kinds. But then there's another aspect around that, I think, which is the role of academia. And there's a fantastic paper, if any of you are interested, by Brandon Carnovan, which talks about the ecosystem of expertise for academics and sustainable development. And what it says is actually we need loads of different kinds of people. And I think Simon referred several times to the fact we're expected to do all of these things, and nobody can be good at all of these things, and nobody has time to do all of these things brilliantly. But in a sense, academia needs to have people who are very good at doing pure science, who understand physics and therefore can understand what kinds of processes might shear a glacier off a mountain. Science also needs the people who can go and do the public engagement, who can come out and say to people, we've published all these papers on glaciers and we are screwed, a direct quote. So, who can engage with people and say that. That's a kind of public engagement bit. Science also needs people who can talk across disciplines and who can understand a little bit about the physics of glaciers falling off a mountain, but who also understand some of the ways in which communities might respond to that and talk to people in social science and in science to try to work with the policymakers and the planners in that area to develop the kind of solutions for what might happen, and obviously with local people. But then there's also the technical aspect. So sometimes when you're measuring glaciers, you need particular technical things and people who can do that technical stuff. We've got a guy, Richard, I'm sure you know, in our school, who has this fabby-doozy technical thing that can go and look at what happens when glaciers calve in the Antarctic. That technical expertise is really important, but it's slightly different from the others. So that's another kind of expertise that you need. And then you also need somebody who can support public deliberation, who can support, people saying, what kind of science do we need? What do we prioritize in our areas or at a global level? And in what ways are we prepared to get involved through citizen science or other ways? So these are all sorts of different ways in which academia needs to respond to and respond to the crises and help to deliver solutions. And you'll find that individuals are sometimes doing more impact or doing more teaching or doing more public engagement or doing more pure research. But we all need to find our way, but across science as a whole, academia as a whole, we need people to do all of those different things. I don't know if that fully answers what you were talking about, but contribution. So just in terms of competing for grants, I mean, the way that most grants work is people come up with different ideas, usually in teams these days, and then they compete for that, and then there's a panel of assessors who are very experienced in the field and who will declare conflicts of interest. And so there is a way of kind of saying, let's take the best ideas, the ideas that are most relevant, the ideas, and sometimes increasingly now those are not just about the best core science, but the science that will generate the most impact. And when we write a grant, we have to write a pathway to impact, which explores the ways in which we think this is important to society. So in a sense, that is taken account of in the way that we are competing for grants. So I think Scotland is different. So the question is kind of around how the wider political processes help us embed these kind of sustainability aspirations and actions. And I think my answer to that is that the UK at the moment is a very difficult context, but Scotland is a more positive context, and that there are countries that are doing very interesting things, but no country that's doing everything brilliantly. So Scandinavia is often very interesting at pushing things forward in different kinds of ways. And the Netherlands, quite interestingly, is doing quite amazing things with rewilding. There's some interesting rewilding processes going on in Romania as well, but because of some of the remaining corruption and governance issues there, there's a struggle to kind of push things forward in more degrees. We can learn a lot from the Global South. So in Ecuador, for example, there's this notion of Buen Vivir, and they actually embedded this notion of well-being of people and planet into their policy at a national level. They've had challenges around the implementation of that, but that's something we can definitely learn from. In Wales, they have a well-being bill, which helps to drive and embed a lot of sustainability action in what happens in Wales. So there are examples from different countries where they are really trying to do things at a national level. Sometimes the implementation is more challenging. But I'm getting looks at from here. I think we're just about to round up.
Well, I'm getting looks at from somebody you can't see outside the door. So we've managed to go effortlessly over time there, which we barely noticed. Just to let people know, we've got a little feedback book, a comments book just outside on the table there. So please put your comments in there, because we will take them into account going forward for the rest of the series. pick up one of these, stick it on your fridge so you don't forget the rest of the talks through the winter. The next one, make sure I get it right, is on the 26th of November, same time, same place. We've got Dr. Antonia Eastwood, who now works for the RSPB, but she very recently was a researcher at the James Hutton Institute, and Dr. Mike Rivington, who will be joining us remotely on Zoom, who works at the same institute, James Hutton, but up in Aberdeen. So we'll be talking about biodiversity and the food system, and combining those two should be really interesting. There was one other thing I was supposed to say. Oh, sign-up sheet, yes. So if any of you are desperate to join Extinction Rebellion, which I'm sure you are by now, there's a sign-up sheet just out there. If you put your email, phone number, one of us will get in touch with you and let you know how to join in with all the rest of us. So I'd like to say thank you so much to our two speakers. It's been absolutely fascinating, and we could have gone on for another hour, I think, but thank you both. And thanks to everyone for coming, and see you on the 26th.